Hello everyone, and welcome to this latest video recording in the RICS Tech Partner Program series. My name is Andrew Knight. I've been with RICS for over 11 years now, and I work within the standards, regulation and thought leadership part of the organization. My role is to look at the whole effect of data and technology right across the built and natural environment. And with over 110,000 members working worldwide, right across the property life cycle, from planning, development, land, construction, finance, operations, valuation, property management, and end of life. Clearly, there's a huge canvas upon which data and tech is having a very, very positive impact. And indeed, our members work right across a whole variety of asset types, from land itself through residential, commercial, alternative assets and infrastructure. So a very wide-ranging and interesting topic. And today I'm really happy to have Daniel joining me from Urban Intelligence. So please do come on the call, Daniel.
Hi, Andrew. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Nice to have you on. Now, I always like, before we get into the kind of bits and bytes and the tech side, it's always nice to have a bit of kind of the human angle here. So it'd be great to hear a bit about your backstory and the origin story of Urban Intelligence itself.
Absolutely. So by background, I'm actually a planner. And so that, to be honest, there aren't a huge amount of planners that are involved in prop tech one way or another. Those that are tend to be on the private sector side, so helping to identify land for development. I guess one of the things that is quite unique about us and the work that we do is that I actually started my life as a planning policy officer, so preparing local plans within a council, and it was actually there that I discovered that there was a huge problem, if you like, with the nature of the work that we were doing. Obviously, we kind of aspire, we think of planning as being very forward-looking, but actually some of those forward-looking lofty kind of goals, they get lost in the day-to-day processes, and planning has effectively become really bureaucratic. And a lot of the time it's around just getting through processes and reaching plan milestones, as opposed to actually thinking about the big trends and the big things that are going on. So yeah, I previously also worked as a consultant, and it was actually working between the two, working within government and then working as a consultant, that I discovered that there were huge gaps in data availability. A lot of the stuff that I had access to in the council, I didn't have access to in the private sector. And on the flip side, in the private sector, I had a lot of other resources that I probably didn't have access to in the council. And so I thought Urban Intelligence would be a great way to kind of fix that gap and fill that gap in that regard.
And I guess out of that has come this solution you call Placemaker. Tell us a bit more about how that specifically came about.
Yeah, absolutely. So Placemaker is a technology platform for preparing local plans. Actually, it kind of evolved from a couple of mini failures, if you like. We started off by developing a product that we called, rather geekily, Howard, after Ebenezer Howard, the father of the Garden Cities movement. That was actually a planning policy search engine. So the idea behind it was that you could type, say, car parking in Camden, and every policy reference from the National Planning Policy Framework or NPPF down to neighborhood plans, you could basically quickly, it was all indexed, so you could quickly retrieve the information. What we discovered, though, was that that solution actually required quite a lot of professional knowledge. So it still required that professional planner knowledge, and it also required the human eyeball to actually interpret the policy. So the next iteration was a product that we called SiteScore, which was a lot more quantitative, and in terms of the metrics, it took a lot of the qualitative policy stuff and made it a lot more quantitative, so we could do quite large-scale geospatial analysis. What we were trying to do was, originally we were trying to create mini reports, so you could click on a site and download reports really, really quickly. But what we actually discovered was that in our third iteration, actually working with a range of different projects with clients such as Transport for London and several local authorities, including the London Borough of Hounslow, which is one of our key co-development partner clients for Placemaker, was that there was a huge potential application for using geospatial analysis to do plan making at scale. And that's very much where we started the Placemaker project back in 2020. So the idea behind Placemaker actually came from a GLA London plan policy objective to identify about 15% of sites on small sites of less than a quarter of a hectare. So obviously it's well known that there's a massive shortage of housing across the country, but particularly in London and the southeast. And the London plan or the London planners observed that there was a particular challenge with identifying generally a lot of the energy in the planning and development process goes into larger, more strategic sites because you get more kind of bang for your buck. And the idea was that we could use technology to actually help undertake a similar objective assessment of smaller sites, but basically use the machine or bot, if you like, to undertake a lot of those works. And so the idea was that we would be sifting across all sites, and that would enable us to spot where maybe sites had fallen between the gaps just because they weren't of sufficient size. And that's very much where Placemaker started, like I say, about 2 years ago now.
So, I mean, from that kind of local authority council perspective, are there other issues that Placemaker is specifically addressing? Because you talked very eloquently there about this challenge of effectively aggregating these kind of smaller infill sites to aggregate into the local plan as a whole. Are there other issues that Placemaker's helping with in that way?
Yeah, to be honest, a lot of the features, and I appreciate software is very much about features and new functions and new tools. And actually what we've been trying to do, actually making up for some of the earlier mistakes I mentioned with Howard and SiteScore, instead of trying to develop these things on spec because we thought it was a cool idea or a good idea, actually we've been very much demand-led. And so we've been asking councils what they really struggle with. And so actually a lot of attention at the moment is very much on engagement. And so the plan process, to be honest, it's really slow and arduous. It normally takes about 4 to 5 years to adopt a plan. A lot of those processes involve lots of administration, but actually it's those public consultations that eat up quite big chunks of that timeline. So what we've been doing in terms of the latest features, apart from site identification and assessment, is actually using the tool to undertake much faster and much more effective public consultation. So the idea is, instead of just to give you an example, historically, members of the public, they would fill out a paper form, they would post that into or email it into the council. The council officers would then have to literally download or interpret all of the comments that had been made. They then have to upload a geospatial representation of the site onto a map. And basically there are just huge amounts of extra work that were created through all of those different steps that we've now basically consolidated into one tool. So the idea now is that a member of the public can just go to the web form, it's all interactive, all of the sites go straight into the planners' databases. And we've also been developing a range of site assessment tools that we mentioned where you're able to objectively assess the sites for their suitability, their availability, and their things like accessibility and achievability is one of the many abilities that the planners have to try and demonstrate in order to ensure that their plans are sound. So what we've been doing is working out how we can use technology and data, particularly geospatial data, to try and bridge some of those gaps to make the whole process more efficient, to make council officers' lives easier.
And what kind of tangible results are they seeing? Is it sort of efficiency plus literally making the process quicker, or obviously still going through the due diligence, but are they seeing these kind of tangible outputs in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Yeah, sure.
So this is an example where we've been working with Birmingham City Council. So just to give you a bit of a contrast, just to show you a kind of before and after. So Birmingham previously undertook a SHLAR exercise, a strategic housing land availability assessment. Those who are familiar with planning will know there are plenty of acronyms. The previous strategic housing land availability assessment exercise was done in 2019, and a whole team of officers, it took around 11 months to basically identify and appraise about 1,059 sites. just to give you an example of what Placemaker has done, we've actually analysed every square inch of the entire city. Birmingham is really quite an exciting place to do this as well, because it's the largest local authority area in Europe. We analysed about 330,000 sites as part of the exercise, and it took about 6 months. So you can see the productivity gain just by using an automated process has been quite dramatic. And what the council have been able to do was identify a short list of around 6,000 sites that could have had suitability, and they've actually proceeded with identifying 600 new sites that were previously unidentified, largely brownfield, I think almost entirely actually brownfield sites. They're now proactively contacting landowners and actually suggesting, instead of them relying on landowners kind of coming forward as part of the call for sites process, what they're actually doing is being more proactive and actually contacting maybe people that aren't, you know, part of the usual suspect club, that aren't the large house builders, to see if they might be interested in bringing their sites forward because they've been pre-identified or pre-screened as having suitability, if that makes sense.
It does. No, and I particularly like that anonymous quote, because I think that sort of very strongly emphasizes this sense that actually this is about augmenting human beings. This is not about replacing them in that way. It's about saying, actually, let the computer do that heavy lifting in terms of that data aggregation and that analysis, but you still need the human beings for the kind of due diligence. So it's a nice kind of touch there, that complementary role of technology and human judgment.
And to be honest, that is a big part of our secret. Of one of the things that we've learned is that it's about combining the two. Property is very, as you're probably more aware than most, it's very professional led. So in terms of identifying and actually bringing a property development scheme into fruition, it involves lots of different professional stakeholders, from the planners to the surveyors, the architects, the ecologists, the flood risk consultants, etc. And what we're trying to do is to leverage the technology to do the bits where, for example, if you've got a methodology of assessing a site suitability, you can actually scale that up really dramatically and actually do the last mile, as it were, using more traditional human assessments. And if you've got kind of borderline sites that are a bit more complex, it makes a lot more sense to invest more time on those sites, as opposed to, you know, kind of wasting lots of time on sites that are non-starters from the beginning. So what we're trying to do is to do really high level screening exercises using the technology, and then, as I said, the kind of the last mile, that being done by a team of officers. And what that means as well is that they can be far more productive. To be honest, a lot of planners prefer spending time on the kind of the more interesting or problematic sites, as opposed to doing lots of kind of mundane site assessment, going through checklists, if you like, repetitively. So a lot of this technology is saving a lot of time and a lot of energy, and making planners' lives a little bit easier.
Indeed. And in what other ways is this changing the kind of traditional approach? Because in some respects, clearly there are pieces of the process that they are there. You can't sort of change elements of the process. But I mean, you mentioned one thing there about being able to be much more proactive to reach out to landowners. But are you seeing some other subtle sort of tweaks of the way people are now almost working with this kind of approach that means they are changing the way they're doing things?
Yeah, so absolutely. So historically, like you were saying just then, the cycle of a plan, it normally starts with almost sites that get voluntarily submitted as part of that call for sites. And that means that you generally get a limited number of sites that come forward, because it's only those with an interest, the professionals that have got agents on retainer or that kind of thing, that they can actually bring sites forward. And there are huge amounts of lands that are owned by, you know, average Joes, if you like, but that don't necessarily, they aren't property professionals, they're not property experts, but they might be in really good sustainable locations that could really contribute towards meeting a whole range of different objectives, not just housing requirements, but also could be potentially unlocking new public sites for open space or whatever it might be, to meet some of the other objectives that the planning system is trying to meet. I guess the challenge is that we are a little bit constrained by the legislation at the moment. It's very prescriptive, and it was obviously intended for a very different era from the digital era, but hopefully we can touch on a bit later how
Indeed, yeah.
the LERB or the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill is actually helping to unlock a lot more of that innovation and enable some of that more innovative, those more innovative approaches to actually unfold.
So Daniel, when a planner now sits down in front of your platform, how have you kind of optimized that, to use the jargon, the user interface? Because clearly, most of the profession, they're not tech people by default. They want to get their job done. They're professionals with that kind of knowledge set. So how have you made sure that that interface is productive and easy to use? Because clearly there's lots of potential data sets that you're aggregating to look at this. How are you making that UI, to use the jargon, as simple as possible? Because otherwise there is this challenge of making software easy to use for people who don't want to spend days and days learning a platform.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's probably easier to show than to try and describe.
Yeah, thanks,
Andrew. So I'm only able to show you sites that are in the public domain. Like I said, we assessed quite a few, but just to kind of give you an example, using the old SCHLAR data from 2019, which is in the public domain, what planners are actually generally preparing plans on. It might sound really silly when you think about what technologies other industries are leveraging. So, for example, if you compare an industry like fintech or financial services, it's really like coming back to the Flintstones in terms of the tools that planners are using. So, a lot of plans are just produced using spreadsheets. They're just produced. The actual documents are just created in Word. It's actually really quite low tech. I appreciate Microsoft are quite high tech in some ways, but actually the technology that planners are using is somewhat low tech. So what we've actually done, coming back to your question around the user interface, is we've actually designed a one-stop shop tool that planners can use to identify sites that meet certain criteria. So, for example, if they want to analyze the sites that have been suitably assessed for, I don't know, let's say residential development, they can select from a shortlist. And what they can do is actually go from site to site and actually view using this powerful dashboard that we've created. I always love giving a live demo. So we've actually created a dashboard where they can actually save their notes. They can view all sorts of things like land ownership. So in this case, you can see that about 85% of the site is covered by this land title. All of this stuff, they would have had to go and do lots of legwork to go and find it all. They'd have to go, if they were doing a site assessment, they'd have to switch between screens to see the site in its context. And actually, it's just really simple to design iterations, but by knowing the kind of processes and the different boxes that the officers have got to tick, that we've been able to create this really nice interface that actually Birmingham in particular are really super keen on. As I said, that about 6,000 sites, all of their officers have now pre-screen. They've not just done the automated assessment, they've actually manually gone through and screened them and assessed whether they thought that based on their or professional considerations that they were actually suitable. It wasn't just kind of computer says yes or computer says no. And just to give you a couple more examples on the interface front. So what you can see here is the geographic information systems layers. They can all be overlaid so you can actually understand the site and its context. So, for example, if a site's affected by, I don't know, flood risk, or it's been allocated for a certain purpose, you can visualize this and actually understand how the site might be partially impacted. And what officers can do as well is they can actually create sub-sites. So let's say that the right-hand side of the site, I'll just do a quick rough one, was unsuitable. What they can do is actually just create mini sites that would assess those in their own in isolation. But it's a whole range of tools that enable a whole audit trail. So, for example, if an officer makes a decision, they can actually that they can see the notes that previous officers might have made. And when it comes to plan examination, when they're having to demonstrate to inspectors that their plans are sound, it's going to create this entire audit trail, which actually really objectively explains the methodology of the site assessment process that each site has rigorously gone through. So it's a whole range of little things like that that actually really make a difference in terms of the planner's kind of day-to-day life. And as I mentioned as well, we've also created a range of tools for the members of the public to submit their own data as well as part of that process.
Indeed, as part of that engagement piece. So you obviously mentioned Birmingham. Are there other sort of names you can share with us that you're working with at this kind of level?
Yeah, absolutely. So to be honest, we're actually finding that a lot of innovation, as we kind of mentioned at the top, it tends to be that the private sector get a lot of the love, and there are other solutions out there where and don't get me wrong, it's probably for good reason. That selling to public sector isn't easy. I can tell you from experience, but actually the processes are improving. And to be honest, what we've discovered is that the councils in particular are really almost forgotten or neglected a customer or client that could, desperate. They're almost gagging for a solution.
Yeah.
They're just using MS Access databases, spreadsheets, Word, and so really quite simple things can make a huge difference. I demonstrated, or I showed you I think it was about 300 times productivity gain that they got just by applying a geospatial algorithm to assess sites. So yeah, it's really fascinating. So in terms of councils, we started off, as I mentioned, with Hounslow. We actually then worked with Birmingham. We're working with Tunbridge and Malling, which is a rural authority. And actually, we're learning quite a lot as we go, working with these different kinds of councils. They've got different challenges. So the urban authorities are obviously, it's almost just like build everywhere at any time. We just need the numbers. And in some cases where you've got these rural authorities, they've got a lot more there's a lot more politics involved in the processes in terms of thinking about the unlocking of potentially greenfield or greenbelt sites. Government policy is also quite a little bit confused at the moment. There's a bit of a tug of war, if you like, between the reality of trying to meet these housing objectives whilst having relatively constrained the areas that councils have got to find these sites on. And so actually the technology, literally the quote that a lot of our clients use is leaving no stone unturned by applying this geospatial approach to assessing sites, and actually make sure that they're able to demonstrate again confidently and it's actually to a range of stakeholders. It's the officers, obviously, just in terms of helping them with their jobs, but it's also communicating strategy ideas and planning policy strategies to the members, to councillors, as part of the public engagement exercise. They're able to communicate with citizens, and eventually as well, they're going to be able to hopefully communicate with those examiners or inspectors when it comes to plan examination too.
Indeed. No, and it's nice that you mentioned that rural aspect, because I was going to probe around that fact that they're clearly looking at a conurbation or an urban area like Birmingham is very different from looking from the challenges of the different context of still wanting to do development, but in that very politically different and indeed context different. I'm interested to probe around the fact that quite often when you develop technology, you almost in a happy way get some unintended consequences in terms of people discovering other ways of using the platform. What are the things that people started to use the platform for that perhaps you hadn't originally thought about, or they've just realized they can use it for yet another purpose?
Yeah, so one of the asks, it's almost like everywhere we go now, actually there are a couple of good examples on this. So one is planning applications data. So every council has normally got some sort of system. iDocs and Northgate are like kind of the big suppliers of these back office systems. And historically, it's been quite difficult to interact between systems, and so a lot of this data is locked in. And so planning applications data is obviously vital from a plan making perspective for understanding what actual supply is coming down the path, what status has it got, and this leads into the second point, which is around monitoring. Monitoring is actually a huge exercise that councils have to go through each year. Going back to my own time as a planning officer, I used to have a Vespa, and I used to go out around the council area and actually assess sites, and I'd have a clipboard and I'd make a judgment as to whether the roof was on in order to be able to help the council understand what completions has actually come forward. So what a lot of councils that we're talking to, what they've actually expressed a huge amount of interest in is basically like a special form where they can submit it to the developers directly, again similar to the call for sites, where they can just submit their own data. And so it again cuts out a huge amount of officer requirement, where developers potentially as part of a section 106 or a planning obligation, they would just have to require the developer to submit updated data, but that's a huge job. And so the idea is that when it comes to annual monitoring reports, which are vital for local government, but also for central government, when they're tracking how many homes are actually being delivered on the ground, you'd be able to produce those reports at a click of a button if you've got the data. And so it's little things like that, as we've been working with the councils to understand where their pain points are. They've got huge amounts of, to be honest, they've got a lot of problems. There's a lot of room, I think, for technology to actually play a big part. It's just kind of working down the wish list, if you like.
Indeed, and I mean, you mentioned, alluded to some of the potential barriers, and it is, it's difficult both in the private and public sector to sometimes overcome those barriers. But what do you still think is getting in the way of councils taking advantage of this kind of technology?
Yeah, so I think procurement has historically been a bit of a challenge, and so in our case, so Placemaker was actually kind of conceived and developed initially at the start of the COVID pandemic. And I won't bore you with the details, but there wasn't a G-Cloud intake. So G-Cloud is the government's procurement framework for digital software tools. And so they haven't had an intake for the last 2 years. So that's made procurement a little bit tougher because we always have to negotiate a license and a deal with each council. And the reason that becomes quite tricky is because it's often a little bit grey as to whether we're a software tool or a consultancy tool. And to be honest, we've actually had to kind of spin it both ways, depending on where we are, spin it both ways, because sometimes councils have got a lot of budget for consultants, but they don't have any tech budget, or they don't, at the moment, they don't quite value tech enough as part of their toolkit, but they've got plenty of budget for the traditional consultants to go produce another report. So in some ways, we've almost kind of had to frame ourselves with a wrapper of being a consultancy service, but actually what we're trying to do is actually embed the technology and get people kind of using that technology in the long term. Another big challenge, and probably even bigger than procurement, is actually just the culture of these organizations around. Again, going back to that point around, they've got a huge budget for consultants, but they haven't got necessarily a tech budget, and that there are often quite challenges about who's in charge of IT. So is it it's very rare that the planning policy team would be in charge of the IT. They'd have to go to the corporate ICT team. There's so many different players are involved. And actually, one of the other particular gaps that we've noticed as well within planning teams is just digital skills and geospatial skills. There aren't enough, to be honest, there aren't enough planners. But there aren't enough planners with either geospatial or GIS skills, or and obviously coding skills. There's probably about 1 or 2 planners out there that have kind of got the full spectrum of being a planner, a GIS person, and a coder. And so I think there's a really big opportunity for councils to actually partner with suppliers like us that are kind of specialised, and we've developed very specialist teams in carrying out a lot of these digital functions. And I think, going back to that LERB point earlier, I think a lot of this is going to be a lot more forthcoming as government further encourages the adoption of digital technologies. And we have seen a great improvement over the last year or so on that front, thanks to the engagement fund activities that the digital land team at DLUC, or the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, what they've been, the work that they've been doing, which has been really great.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, that there are specific, pieces in the Levelling Up bill that talk about, planning technology and planning software. I mean, what specifically do you think that the reform agenda may help? I mean, is it purely almost getting this on the table, on the agenda, or are there some specific things that you think that the bill will help with?
Yeah, so well, from our perspective, a lot of the energy at the moment is going into public engagement and trying to widen participation.
Mm.
Um, Personally, I think that the system's a little bit flawed, and there are some fundamentals that need to be changed in order to encourage more people to actually get involved in the process. Because at the moment, basically, it's almost a little bit of a stitch up that the consultation tends to be a bit of a tick box exercise. You're trying to get people involved, but it's so much investment has gone into making decisions that actually there's only really small amounts that can actually be incrementally changed. And so I think leveraging technology to do a lot more, going back to that proactivity point, a lot more proactive consultation at the beginning, where they could potentially really model and shape the way that towns and cities or villages are going to grow. I think that could be great. But the other part that is quite obvious as well, a lot of these larger incumbents. So I mentioned IDOCs earlier. So historically, they probably wouldn't have entertained a smaller supplier like us, but actually, since the LERB, the publication, they've been trying to demonstrate that they're not as bad as they may be painted out to be. So we've been working with IDOCs to actually explore the use of creating an API between platforms. So the idea is that that planning application data I mentioned earlier, we'd be able to just get a live feed straight into the system. And to be honest, like in most other industries, so for example, if you work in, I don't know, SaaS or sales or accounting, like all of these different, for example, if you use open banking, lots of these applications, they all speak to each other, and obviously they're dealing with really secure information and data, and so it can be done. It's just a matter of getting the culture and of wanting to get this data sharing going, and it can be a little bit challenging, sorry, where personal data is involved as well. But a lot of geospatial stuff isn't that personal. It's very much objective things around, especially around land and property and things like that. So there's a huge opportunity, I think, for better data sharing, because there are lots of companies out there doing great things with technology, particularly in prop tech. And we should all be kind of working together where we can. It's just about creating those incentives to make sure that the suppliers aren't always, they've got enough competitive tension to be innovative and hungry, but at the same time they're not kind of just like arms folded, doors closed, which actually means that everyone's kind of reinventing their own separate wheel to solve the same as similar problems, if that makes sense.
Indeed. No, and there's certainly, I mean, I think there's a lot of momentum now in the market to recognise that there is a huge opportunity to digitise the planning process, whether it's individual planning applications or local plans. And, so much of it is data driven. And as you say, I mean, if you think about the process of an existing planning application, a lot of it is in the public domain. Most of it is. If you put your own personal plan in, it's in the public domain, who you are, what you're asking to do, all the objections and comments. So I think those things can be overcome. So what more do you think that the direction of travel would be? I mean, I know you're, as you say, talking to people like iDocs, and I believe you're working with UCity, who's another tech partner, because there's obviously opportunities to integrate with other systems that can visualize what a plan would look like, as well as what you're doing in terms of that site assessment and that kind of viability piece.
Yeah, so for me, and it comes back to the very top, like I said, I'm a planner by background, and so what I really want to see is a much better planning system. And for me, what that looks like is one where you can ask really difficult questions at the beginning. At the moment, the problem that we have is that all of our systems are in document PDF form, and if you want to find out what a consultant or a developer has said about a certain site, you have to do a lot of digging to find information. So I do think opening up is going to make a huge difference. But what I would like to see, going back to that point around citizen engagement, is that using this computational power, if you like, to model what different outcomes could look like. So for example, let's say you set the policy at, I don't know, in a suburban setting, about 30 to 40 dwellings per hectare, which isn't incredibly dense. But what about if you increase that by 20%? what impact would that have on across quite large areas or regions? And at the moment, the planning system isn't able to offer up answers. It's like, for example, if how many properties are currently going back to this the point around energy performance certificates, for example, which is a huge point of interest. We're speaking to quite a lot of clients at the moment that are looking to identify old stock that's going to need regeneration to meet or renovation in order to meet the government's objectives of being EPC rating B by 2030. And to be honest, it's actually quite difficult to work out the quantities of how many properties are going to be affected by that policy. But if you can stitch lots of these different data sets together, you can ask complex questions. Well, we're trying to meet our objective of reaching net zero. How can you model in the carbon impact of developments? How can you model in the additional congestion that's going to be created on the roads by the number of extra cars that are going to come from these developments? And what I'd like to see from the planning system is actually that data is being leveraged so we can actually see the impact, and we can actually have honest conversations with each other about to communicate the trade-offs that are involved in development, because it's not just about at the moment, and it's a very, very bad system in that a lot of people just get kind of almost tarred as NIMBYs because they don't want development. But the thing is, it's actually you're often leaping into the unknown of what you're actually going to get, and using tools like ViewCity, where you can actually model these kind of beautiful visualizations to understand what developments could look like from different angles and things like that, but also understanding how policy decisions could impact it could impact a whole range of other things. It's not just housing numbers, it's about understanding, like I said, the additional usage of school places or hospital beds. All of this stuff should be planned much more holistically, and I think in this day and age, the data is probably out there somewhere buried in someone's USB stick or filing cabinet. We need to try and unlock it so we can think as a planner, as planners, about how our almost cities work as these great organisms, and how we can leverage this data to make much better decisions, but for a whole range of purposes, obviously to get better outcomes, but also from a productivity and a cost perspective for the taxpayer, actually making sure that we're making the right infrastructural development decisions, so we're growing in the right way or the optimal way to prepare ourselves for a future generation, if that makes sense.
Indeed, no, it's funny well, not funny you mentioned that, in a very profound, because I saw a report recently that was quoting that development in West London is going to be limited because there isn't enough electricity infrastructure now. They've reached the limit of that critical piece of infrastructure, because you often think of schools and doctors and those kind of soft infrastructure, but you forget that we need the fundamental, physical infrastructure as well. So as you say, their data is out there somewhere. It's this aggregation and linking it together, particularly in this geospatial way, to make it all add up and make these decisions, sensible. Well, it's been a fascinating conversation, Daniel. Thanks so much for your time today, and I look forward to catching up with you again in the future. But for today, thanks ever so much.
No worries. Thanks very much, Andrew.